Welcome to part 1 of this Waste Expert presentation series on understanding waste management legislation and regulation. There are numerous pieces of legislation that your organisation will have to comply with in relation to waste management. And the aim of this presentation series is to help you understand how it applies to you and what you must do in order to be compliant. This presentation series has 4 parts to it which you should listen to concurrently. Part 1 provides an introduction to waste legislation and regulation in the UK, including a focus on why this legislation exists and who regulates it. This presentation will also cover the legal definitions and classifications of waste, so you can identify which legislation applies to the types of waste that you produce. Part 2 provides an overview of the concept of duty of care and how this has been embedded in all of waste management legislation. Part 3 will introduce you to some of the more complex legislation that exists. And Part 4 provides an overview of how to ensure compliance with these pieces of legislation through developing a compliance management system. Firstly, let's look at why we have waste legislation and regulation in place in this country. Waste management is one of the most heavily regulated areas of environmental law, and this is because of the potentially huge risks that it poses to human health and the environment. Increasingly, waste management legislation is also focusing on sustainable waste management. This is to ensure that waste is managed in a way that considers resource efficiency and future environmental, social and economic implications. Waste legislation in the UK is controlled by designated regulators. These regulators are responsible for implementing legislation to control waste management activities. They also have a role in contributing to the future development of waste policy and legislation. These regulators are the Environment Agency in England and Wales, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency in Scotland, and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency in Northern Ireland. Local authorities also still have some control over some small-scale waste management plants and operations. These regulators are also responsible for permitting waste management sites and facilities and for regulating the movements of waste. They have the power to impose fines and prosecutions for those individuals and organisations who do not comply with legislation. Before we go on to how legislation and regulation impacts you, it's important that you understand the way that waste is defined and classified in the UK. This can directly impact how you manage certain types of waste streams. The legal definition of waste, as set out within the EU Waste Framework Directive, is any substance or object the holder discards, intends to discard, or is required to discard. The key word within the legal definition is discard. Any object therefore becomes a waste once it has been discarded or if there's any intention to discard it. This applies to waste intended for recovery or recycling, as legally the object has been discarded and therefore it is still a waste. The object will remain defined as a waste until it has been fully recovered and no longer poses a potential threat to the environment or human health. In England and Wales, the basic categorisation of waste was introduced by the Environmental Protection Act 1990. This act was responsible for introducing the concept of the classification and categorisation of all waste and for introducing the 3 categories of waste: household waste, commercial waste and industrial waste. Collectively, these 3 categories can be referred to as controlled waste, and it's likely that the majority of the waste that your organisation produces will be defined as such. Household waste is defined as any waste which is generated in domestic dwellings. This category also includes household-like premises. This includes university halls, schools, nursing homes, hotels and prisons. Commercial waste is defined as any waste from premises used wholly or mainly for the purposes of trade or business, or for the purposes of sport, recreation, education, or entertainment. Industrial waste is defined as any waste which is produced from an industrial activity. Such activities may include manufacturing, factory production, or mining processes. It's also useful to have a basic understanding of the history behind waste legislation in the UK. Waste legislation within the UK was historically driven by the EU Waste Framework Directive. The directive provided an overarching legislation framework for the collection, transport, recovery and disposal of waste. It required member states to take the necessary measures to ensure waste was recovered or disposed without endangering human health or causing harm to the environment. This was enforced through the introduction of permitting, registration and inspection requirements. In the UK, the Environmental Protection Act 1990 was developed to help implement the Waste Framework Directive. Since the 1990s, more and more legislation has been developed to regulate areas ranging from pollution control, producer responsibility, through to the management of specific waste streams. Further information on the priority legislation, such as those that deal with permitting and duty of care, will be discussed within Part 2 of this presentation series. Part 3 of the series will provide further information on some of the more complex of these legislation, such as the WEEE regulations and Site Waste Management Plan regulations. The Compliance Analyzer tool within Module 2 of the Waste Expert allows you to assess your current level of compliance, develop an action plan and build a legal register relevant to your organisation and its activities. This ends Part 1 of this presentation series on waste legislation and regulation. It's now recommended that you move on to Part 2, which covers understanding duty of care and other key waste legislation.